It is my great honor to welcome you all to Starfleet Academy.
There's never been a better time to enroll in Star Trek.
It's our job to prepare you for the unimaginable. To the land, cadet!
In high-pressure situations, positive reinforcement is crucial to one's success. You're doing a great job.
This is what we train for. These friends of mine, they all live for something bigger than themselves. And that's Starfleet.
Starfleet Academy. New series now streaming on Paramount+.
I had that dream again. My small business needs to hire, but I don't use LinkedIn, and I hire wrong. So then I'm doing IT, and when I go to plug the servers in, they become sentient, and they won't let us access our network unless we forward their chain emails and memes to more and more and more people, and then I wake up.
Don't let hiring nightmares ruin your dreams. LinkedIn Jobs' new AI assistant finds and invites best fit candidates to apply, so you can discover talent you may have missed. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/quality. Start hiring today with LinkedIn.
Welcome to United Inc. No question about that. Finance Pods with Jamie again today. How's it going, Jamie?
Yeah, very good, Ed. As we just mentioning, there seems to be some moving parts again, which I'm looking forward to diving into.
Awesome. Yes, always are. It's Manchester United. There's a story every minute, but finance is the top of the mind at the moment. All right, so today on the agenda, we're going to talk about wages and where we're at. There was an Athletic article few days ago, following on from Sir Jim's comments when he did his media round a couple of weeks ago, to a little bit about squad cost rule, what it isn't going to be next year, what it is going to be in a couple of years' time, we think. We'll roll that into wage structure, United's potential transfer strategy or ability to play in the market, and some stuff on the stadium. And Joel Glazer talking about refurbing Raymond James Stadium in Tampa Bay. What a lot of stuff going on already. How are you doing anyway?
Yeah, good. It's been interesting. I mean, you talked about the Athletic article, and I think it's been interesting to follow, and just in terms of overall football finance, like the level of detail that now seems to be coming out, and it's great for the finance nerds like myself. But I think it's also great, I think, just in terms of transparency. I think it's going to be an interesting time, I think, not just at United, but across all clubs. Yeah, as we think about stadiums and profitability of the clubs. I nearly had a Freudian slip there and called it a business.
Sadly, we have to think about it like that, don't we, these days?
Yeah. I've been very careful in my written work to not refer to it as a business, because I don't think it truly is like any other business. But there are dynamics there which we do have to consider.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The fact that a regulator is coming in will tell you that it's not just any other ordinary industry. There's very specific dynamics in the football market that are coming to play, which some of our friends from over the other side of the pond sometimes seem to forget. All right, we're going to talk about the wages. The Athletic wrote a piece following on from Sir Jim in one of his interviews. He sort of threw away this line that United's wages were £250 million, and then kind of followed up on that and said that actually, if you take into account the injuries, our wage budget is something like Nottingham Forest or Everton's. And they were both throwaway lines. So where are we actually at? Because Sir Jim's 250 million comment felt high to me if you just track from the UEFA Landscape report a couple of years ago and then look at all the cuts that have been made and try and divorce the player wages from the overall wages. That felt high. What was your thoughts on what the number might actually look like?
Yeah, so I think the overall wage bill of Manchester United is around about 365 million. And so I think Jim was specifically referring to the men's first team cost. Now, there's obviously a lot of hot debate about this in terms of exactly where the number lies. And I think a part owner of a club coming out and giving a roundabout figure is as close as anyone's ever got to this. But I was actually at about 240 million pounds, so a shade under the 250. So it didn't surprise me all that much. And you can track all sorts of news flow you can also do some like cross-checking, back of the envelope sort of calculations. And there's an element of like the 250 million almost seems a little bit low, actually, because then if you think about the non-playing side of the organization, you've kind of got about 1,100 staff, right? And so that mean, well, yeah, you won't going forward, but as we were the last set of results, around 1,100 staff. If you then kind of take out that 250 from the 360, you've kind of got 110 million left, which, very simple maths tells you that the total cost of those other staff on average per person is about £100,000. Now, that does include things like employer taxes as well. So you're kind of getting to an overall salary of about £85,000 if you take those taxes away. May seem high because I think there are a lot of people within the organization who are nowhere near that. But then I think, as with a lot of these things, you do get a little bit of a Pareto effect where former leadership would have been on pretty significant wages.
4.5 million in terms of Ed Woodward, but yeah.
Exactly. So the numbers overall do stack up to me. There are, I think, a few nuances here which are important to understand. And I think some people will already be aware of this, but the idea that when Manchester United aren't in the Champions League, there is an inbuilt reduction in wages of around 25%. That's kind of standard across the board and not unique to United. The one thing that I thought was really interesting actually is not everyone is on that. So I think there was a specific reference to Luke Shaw, who was his reduction in wages is less than the 25% allegedly. And that's kind of interesting. And I think almost an indictment of how decisions potentially used to get made, where if you look at Luke Shaw's track record of injuries, to actually have him on a reduction that's less than the average, you can start to see why United's cost base starts to become a bit of an issue, because it is hard to move on some of these players when you take into account injury records, performances, and also age.
Yeah, I think it's a good piece, isn't it? Because the whole industry has gone to more performance-based pay. So bonuses that relate to additional revenue, being in additional competitions. The squad cost rule, as we're going to talk about in a bit, basically reflects that idea as well. To some extent, it's a bit of a blunt force tool.
Yeah.
But yeah, the overall wage budget is an interesting one because you track it down and so go from last published accounts, full published accounts, and track some of the people who've left. It's probably the next full accounts, it'll be quite a bit lower, I imagine, just how much they're losing out of their wages from players who are leaving or contracts that are ending, the impact of not being in the Champions League, as you mentioned, and so on and so on. So
yeah, and I think
it's tracking down quite steeply.
Well, we've already got a slight indication of that, right? So like the latest set of results, I think on average it's something around somewhere between 10 to 15% is the reduction in the wages, in the overall wage bill. Now that won't have a lot of the impact of the non-playing staff reductions coming through, but it will have things like Varane and Martial leaving. But I think somewhere between a 10 and 12% reduction probably does indicate that actually that standard 20 to 25% pay cut rule is not necessarily the case at United. And I think we can also talk about the wage structure. And I think Jim's comments touched on this in particular, where it's like, I think it was something like half of the highest earning players at the club either aren't available, whether that's through loans, injuries, etc. If you looked at the start of this season, I think it was something in the region of around 6 to 8 players who were on more than £250,000 a week.
That would be a total package. But yeah, you're right. I mean, he's right to say that, because if you add up the highest earners, it would who are not regular starters, it would include Luke Shaw, Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, Casemiro's definitely in there. Now you can argue whether he's a starter or not these days, Mason Mount and so on. And it just like through injury or whatever reason, form or being cast away from the squad, they are not there. And it's a totally unsustainable place for any football club. But given it's £300 million losses over the last 3 years, then it's ridiculous, isn't it?
And I do think the club will get back to a situation where it can facilitate maybe not the same sort of wage structure, but like a little bit more balanced, and where you do have people earning over £200,000 a week in its entirety. But I think what you're already seeing is some like pretty significant steps to fix that wage structure. And I think almost laying the foundations for the next 3 to 5 years. Jim has always talked about this is going to be a long process, and it's not just about who they're getting rid of, it's who's coming in to replace it. So the likes of Dorgu coming in on £40,000 a week and having some staggered increases within his contract. Ahmad recently renewed. And I think there was like a little bit of negotiation there, but it's not like he, after a good half a season, went to the 200 to 250. It was within that 100 to 125, which is clearly obviously still a lot of money, but also gives it room to grow and kind of incentivizing him in the right way. You've now also, when you're looking at the highest paid players, Bruno, he's now one of the leading players of the club. And I think if you think where this went wrong, Alexis Sanchez, De Gea, and the benchmarks that were set there in terms of performance, having Bruno as one of your highest earners makes a lot of sense, and it helps cascade everything off him. We can talk about Cobby in this environment as well. I think a lot of what you hear is the noises that are coming out from his agents. I just think we're past the time now where United will be handing out contracts where players earn too much too soon. Yeah.
Well, it would certainly be interesting with Kobe Mainoo. It's kind of a benchmark, isn't it, for the new regime, and how high they prepared to go and how much of a variation is there from what the market would be able to pay him. Because that's the thing, it's hyper competitive. It's 19 other clubs in England, 100 across Europe. And like, how many clubs could pay that sort of wage? I mean, it's maybe 15 or so. That's your market for Kobe Mainoo. Who'd be interested? And like, how much is Mainoo willing to go, okay, I'm 20 years old. Let's be reasonable here. I've got 3 more contracts in my career, big ones. Yeah, it's a good test, because United would have failed this 5 years ago. Like, he would be on the biggest wage straight away.
Totally. And I think that the early signs is that these sorts of tests are being passed, but Cobby will be the big one.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the squad cost rule, because it all plays into this. The Premier League took a vote recently, as they do every international break. They have a meeting. They have 2 sets of meetings. They have the owners' meeting, the shareholders' meeting, as it's called, and then the CEOs' meeting, effectively, which is more operational, I guess. Wouldn't expect Joel to wing it over from the States for a lowly CEOs' meeting, would we? Anyway, they didn't decide to go to the squad cost rule for next season, right? I think I'm right in saying probably the season afterwards, and we'll see whether we get the sort of pegging to the bottom rung club. So let's go through a little bit about what the squad cost rule is and what it isn't and how it's staged, because we do have it in UEFA, and it looks like the Premier League will mirror it to some extent.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to note. So we don't actually yet know much about the draft of what the Premier League version of this may look like. Go way back when, one of the early comments that Sir Jim did make is that, the finance department made it very clear to him that, you've got one set of rules for Premier League, you've got another set of rules for UEFA, and that makes it very, very complicated. I think it would be sensible to kind of have some alignment here. But the UEFA rule is effectively that there is a specific percentage of your revenue that you can spend on wages, on what they call relevant persons. Now, they define relevant persons effectively as the men's playing team and the head coach, I think they've excluded the women's team from this, I think, in order to kind of give it room to expand and give it room to grow and not kind of inhibit it too early on in its development. But effectively, it is the wages of those players and coaching staff, including things like signing on bonuses, performance bonuses, anything that might be related to image rights in terms of how payments are structured. It also includes the amortization or impairment of those transfer fees.
And agents' fees.
And the agents' fees that's included in that. So you've got that kind of as the numerator. And then the revenue, it's not just what you make from match day, merchandising, broadcasting. It's also what you're generating in terms of transfer income.
Yeah, but not asset sales in the UEFA version.
Yeah, not asset sales, which, I don't know, seems pretty sensible. Because I think if you try and understand, like if you try and think like why did these rules come in initially, right? Like there was kind of two reasons if you look about when they were introduced. One was you had a lot of owners that were coming in, owning football clubs, maybe for a bit of notoriety and spending irresponsibly and not being able to back it up. And those clubs kind of like being run into the wall, and you saw lots of administrations go through. There is also a question of like, well, do you want to stop investment? No, probably not, because there is an element of like that is required in order for the game to continue to grow globally. So like, what's the best way of effectively getting the underlying operations of a football club sustainable and self-sustaining? I think one thing that I've always thought is like sustainability is a little bit of a faux pas as a terminology. Like if I put my finance hat on and I'm analyzing a business, really what I care about is how self-sufficient it is, particularly if it's in a growth phase. Can it sustain its own operations? If you limit the biggest element of the cost base to a fixed percentage of the revenue, in theory, that should help stem a lot of the issues.
This episode is brought to you in association with NordVPN. For those of you who don't know, VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. It secures your connection, protecting your personal information and online activity, especially on public Wi-Fi. The VPN enables your phone or laptop to switch its virtual location to another country, which is great for accessing your favorite content while you're traveling. Long-time listeners will know that I've spent a good part of the last 20 years on a plane. I've recorded this podcast in places from Tokyo to Old Trafford, New York to the Northern Quarter, and a VPN has been absolutely essential to watching the game while I'm abroad. True story. I once racked up a £1,500 phone bill watching a United game while I was in Shanghai. I was on my work phone and I blamed it on video calls back to the office. The key lesson of this story is not how to scam your employee out of a large phone bill, but that I couldn't have watched the United game without a VPN. It's been a real lifesaver. If you want to try NordVPN for yourself, go to nordvpn.com/NQAT, and our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. It's the best discount available and equivalent to the price of coffee per month. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link is also in the podcast show notes if you need it. Yeah, and it's much simpler than the old FFP style calculations and much more tied to the actual ability of a club to sustain its own operations. As you say, what we didn't mention was it's kind of staggered. So they had UEFA has staggered it in over 3 years. So the top line, 90% of your revenues can go on squad costs, is where we'll get to for next year's UEFA competition.
I think it's lower than that.
Is it 85? Is it? I can't remember.
So we're in UEFA, we're at 80 at the moment, and then we're moving towards 70.
Okay. Oh yeah, you're right. The other way around. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's an extra stage for clubs that aren't in Europe, or at least that's the proposal in the Premier League version. We think that if you're not in Europe, you could spend up to 85% of your budget. And the idea is that if you're in Europe, you're getting a massive advantage from having all this great competition money and so on and so on. So.
Exactly. You're like, it should, I think they've said at 85% because in theory, the incremental revenue that you'll get from prize money, broadcasting, incremental match day revenue will then automatically mean that you don't effectively qualify for Europe and have to do a fire sale. Your revenue will increase, which will automatically bring down your ratio.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what it did mean was that if you are in the UEFA Conference League, because the money there is about as useful as a fart in a hurricane, isn't it? You got double screwed basically because you don't get the big top line revenue from the Champions League, but you do get the additional squad cost challenges. Let's talk a little bit about the pegging issue, which honestly I thought was, check Urban Dictionary out for what that actually means. Anyway, pegging is this idea that the lowest earning club in terms of broadcast revenue, which would typically be around about the bottom club, it's based on facility fees plus placings, and you take a multiple of 5 on that, and that would be your hard cap limit. So let's say the lowest earning club earns 110 million, it's something like that. The hard cap limit would be 550 million to spend on your squad, and no one would hit that at all. So it's kind of moot, but there's this idea that you're trying to make it equal enough-ish.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, there are some merits to it, but I think, like, if you think dynamically about how revenues might evolve over time, particularly with all the stadium developments that are going on, United isn't the only club in town building a new stadium. You've also got Newcastle United, Arsenal are looking to renovate. Obviously, Tottenham have just done their new stadium. There's conversations about Chelsea and a new stadium there. You've got a number of clubs here who are actively looking to grow the revenue base. When you think about the squad cost rule, that's exactly what it is incentivizing. The more revenue you have, the bigger that 70% of the pie is. I think the big clubs clearly believe that they have a bigger revenue opportunity on the table over the next 5 years. And I think the capping element is, I think, where they start to have an issue because, well, should they be penalized and potentially like held back in European competitions? That's what Sir Jim has said, by this sort of rule, because if you've got this rule in the Premier League and not in UEFA, all of a sudden, like, you can't satisfy both. It's effectively becoming an indirect rule for UEFA for British clubs anyway. So
the interesting thing there, though, is that let's just say it's 550 million, right? Just as a guesstimate, 600 million euros or so. It's really only Barcelona, Real Madrid, and Paris Saint-Germain that would be above that anyway. I mean, so you are, I guess it would place the top English clubs at a disadvantage against those three. I mean, Paris Saint-Germain, we can question how much is actually real. Barcelona, well, they, in theory, have a much lower wage bill than that. In theory, it hasn't actually worked out like that. And the La Liga keep going very, very naughty. We're putting all these rules on you, but we're just going to ignore it when it comes to punishment, which is interesting. It's going to the High Court in Spain, that one. And then Real Madrid's wage budget is, 700 something million? It's huge.
Look, I think the overall point here is, I think the big clubs are obviously wary about regulation, right? Like, if there is a chance that they're going to be inhibited when you've got the best league in the world, arguably the best product in the world, why would you want to inhibit the potential for that to be even better?
Yeah.
And look, you may argue that there's already like a quasi inherent competitive disadvantage versus, say, the Real Madrids and Barcelonas. A lot of players want to end up there anyway. I think my view is like, keep it simple. I understand the concern that the smaller teams within the Premier League have, but I think the reality is like, if you look at revenue across all of the clubs in the Premier League and probably even a lot in the Championship, right, there's significant untapped opportunity. And I actually think English and British clubs more broadly are probably a little bit behind the curve in terms of actually how do they maximize their revenue or create new revenue streams. If you look at Wrexham, it's a prime example. Yes, they've got the help of obviously some Hollywood stars to get them some advertising and commercial income. But actually, if you look at the Deloitte Money League, a lot of the top clubs in the Premier League now, their commercial income is really the element that's like closed the gap.
Yeah.
Even versus United, like Liverpool's commercial income is now greater than Man United's.
Yeah, that's because United's flatlined for years. The genius of Ed Woodward was really only genius for a couple of years, which is a story we probably should go into depth in at some point. Not this pod, but at some point, let's track that, because that narrative always pissed me off. I was like, United might have been early, but then they did not grow from there. Like 6 years, it's been flat, our commercial income, basically.
Totally. And the renewal of, if you think more recently when Jim invested and Omar came in, the renewal of certain deals was actually celebrated rather than kind of like breaking new ground and doing bigger deals.
Yeah, Wrexham's an interesting case study because half their income now comes from outside of Britain. Now, they've gone from like £2 million in revenue to 26 in the last 3 years or so, obviously helped by Hollywood owners, and they're going to be in the Championship next year probably. They will, apart from clubs coming down with the parachute payments, they'll be one of the highest earning clubs in the Championship. We'll see whether that's sustainable. I mean, can they sustain interest in the States, which is driving all of this? And do people get bored with Welcome to Wrexham and the kind of bandwagon there? Yeah.
Well, interesting. I don't know. If they're still involved, I think there might be some interest for a period of time.
We didn't mention, before we move on to sort of United's transfer strategy and cash flow and all of that, we didn't mention Chelsea's accounts, which showed £255 million of losses last year had they not sold the women's team and a hotel to themselves. Maybe the hotel was in the previous financial year, I can't remember now, but they sold the women's team to themselves for £200 million, which, as someone pointed out on Twitter, is a 14x multiple, which is way output. I mean, like, brilliant women's team, fantastic operation. They do transfer planning and succession planning brilliantly on the women's side at Chelsea. You've got to say they are the best performing club on the pitch and off the pitch. But does that translate into a 14x multiple?
I guess it depends on how much you believe on the growth, right? And I think, I was reading up on, some older articles. I think they were initially looking for about £150 million. So I do wonder whether there's been like other bits of, say, land that's been included as part of that valuation. You've got the Deloitte Women's Money League that also was published this year. And the revenue from that in euros was, I think, 110 million. Some significant growth there. And I think there is more room to grow. Look, is it a punchy multiple? Yes. But do you get punchy multiples when things are growing? Yes. So I don't have an issue necessarily with the valuation. Like, will they have to grow into it? And if Todd Boehly sells his, or does end up kind of having to sell his stake at some point, is that going to be something that which provides a hurdle for a buyer coming in? Potentially. But, I think there is an element of, when you're thinking about PSR, have they found another loophole and have they found another issue with some of the wording? If that is the case, it's hard to have any objection with it.
Yeah.
Quite frankly. It'll be interesting to see how they've justified it if we ever find that out. But it's all going to be in the detail of the rules. And I think if there's one thing that we've learned over the last couple of years, whether it's Chelsea, whether it's Leicester, is I think the wording of the rules really need to be kind of closely scrutinized. And that may be something that an independent regulator comes in and kind of takes a look at.
Yeah.
And I think there is also the other element of the oddity of the fact that Premier League clubs can vote for and against these sorts of things. It doesn't look like there was any objection to the Chelsea valuation at the time. So
no, 9 clubs voted with Chelsea on that particular rule, not the valuation. That will go to a fair market committee, because it's the intra-group sale. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. In the startup world, I'm familiar with a 14x multiple. You'd be looking for some real growth headroom on that one. And I mean, women's football, there certainly is. Not broadcast. I mean, they've tied it down for the next 3 years. I think it was a big uplift on the WSL contract, but not the kind of so big an uplift that you would go, oh, hang on a minute, this is now going to become equivalent to a I say, a championship in terms of revenues or something like that. It's quite a long way from there still. It still looks financially like a League One club or something like that, most of these women's teams. So is there growth? Yeah. Is it commercial? Probably. Can you get more people through the door? Yeah, Arsenal have shown you can. If you market it properly. United have not done that very successfully. No. Honestly, there's some really poor attendances when they've gone to Old Trafford. And that may be just where United are as a club. It's 6 years old. It's settled into 4,000 people turning up at Leigh Sports Village and so on. So, yeah, there is growth there. That headline number feels generous, given that a lot of the revenues in women's football are cross sponsorships. So they take a proportion of the sponsorship and go, that's for sponsoring the women's team front of shirt. And so on. So, yeah.
No, totally. But yeah, we'll see if any other clubs have generous valuations for their women's team soon.
And so, Jim, if you'd like to sell a women's team to yourself, because we know how much you care about the United women's team, I think it's worth 500 million. Just saying, how many would like to put that in? Seems unlikely.
The world moves fast. Your workday, even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
Should we talk about United's cash and profitability position? Then we can think about the transfer market and what that might look like. I mean, I know we talked a little bit about this, but
yeah,
profitability and cash, that will dictate United's ability to go spend.
Look, I think linking this back to the squad cost rule, right? So United on the squad cost rule at the moment are obviously well clear of that. 660 million of revenue for this year. 70% of that would put you at somewhere in the region of like 450 million. Jim has already stated it's about 250 million. So no issues there. I think so you might ask, okay, well, why are they not spending more? Why are they not just putting down big swathes of money for transfer fees, on wages, if you've got all of this capacity? As we know, there is the 300 million pounds of losses. As we also know, there's the 90 million of cash that's sitting on the balance sheet, with only another 90 million left on the credit facility. When you take into account transfer fees that are coming down the pipeline, you've really only got 90 million of capacity. So this is where like the player sales are really, really valuable. And I think we mentioned this last time, but also why this is such a long slog to really repair the finances. It won't be just 1 or 2 years of like cuts and an improvement in performance. There really does need to be sustained performance. And linking back to what Omar's talked about in terms of being the most profitable club in the world, they kind of need that. And the reason for that is this metric called free cash flow. Now, for those that are not aware of it, free cash flow is effectively the cash that you need to operate the business. So it's effectively your profits less something called capital expenditure, which is effectively, in this scenario, transfer fees. Mm-hmm. So United, if you look since COVID, have been free cash flow negative basically the whole time, with some pretty big negative numbers coming in that period, particularly during COVID. Historically, they've always been pretty good free cash flow generators. What that effectively means is they are self-funding all of their transfer purchases. Great position to be in. They're so profitable that actually you never need to go to the bank. You never need to look for external funding and owner funding in order to sustain yourselves. One of the reasons why the Glazer family probably was so interested in United in the first place. So the transfer strategy this year, definitely, but I think also for the coming few years is this idea of laying the foundations to be profitable and self-sustain once again. So we know that there are going to be some player sales going through this year. who is it that United are likely to be purchasing in terms of the types of players? Lots of talk about Osimhen, but if a fee is around 60 to 65 million, when you add in agent fees on top, you're probably looking at a 70 million package. When you add wages into that, I think he would be at least 10 to 15 million. So that's an 85 million year one investment.
Yeah.
Now, as we talked about before, may only have 90 million of cash available.
Yeah. Well, it depends how that deal would be structured, but yeah, it looks like right at the limit of what United could potentially spend on a single player, doesn't it? When you think about how much churn there's going to be in the squad.
Totally. Yeah. And then it's why I think why when you look at Garnacho and whether he will be included in the deal, it's almost necessary in order to get a deal through. And so
let's just go back a little bit before we get onto Osimhen and the transfers, like to make a really clear distinction between top line revenue, right?
Yeah.
The thing that is in the money league, basically, versus free cash flow, which is your actual capacity to go spend stuff without borrowing, which United have not been able to do, as you mentioned, and EBITDA, which United make a big fuss about in their quarterly investor calls, because the EBITDA is quite high, which is your earnings before interest, taxation, deductions, amortization. It's just the last bit of that. The amortization bit is really, really high in United's case, which Jim, of course, knew, being old school private equity. He was like, oh, this doesn't stack up. Yeah. And the Glazers were like, please, Bank of America, could you fund our overspending? Which Bank of America was quite happy to do at a 10% interest rate.
Exactly. So on that point about EBITDA, a lot of investors look at it because it's kind of like a metric that is even though it's not completely standardized, it's somewhat universal as like a measure of how much cash is this business making. So when Omar and team are on these investor calls speaking to the market, talking about EBITDA, they're doing that as a signal to be like, look, we're growing EBITDA, which versus your other investments is a great thing. When you look at the underlying health of a business, however, you need to take into account EBITDA with your capital expenditure. So your CapEx gets amortized over time, and that goes into your DNA, as you mentioned, and then the overall cash position of the business. So for United, even though they're generating lots of EBITDA, as you mentioned, their DNA is so high. They've been spending so much on transfers as well as wages that free cash flow figure turns negative.
Yeah.
Which means you're not generating cash and you're running down a rabbit hole of superfluous spending.
Yeah, exactly. All right, and then on transfers, so we know the outgoings are likely to be Jadon Sancho, unless Chelsea want to pay us to not take him. That would be embarrassing for everyone. There's a £25 million fee spread across 5 years on that one. If he goes, I mean, almost the more interesting thing than that, because that is about net even on, we won't take an impairment on that one, basically. But his wages are really high. So getting those wages off the books is what everyone will be looking at. And then same with Marcus Rashford, really. There's a slightly higher fee in the option. You need him to keep scoring goals, please, Marcus, at Aston Villa if you're not coming back. And then obviously he's on very high wage, and that will come off the books as well, assuming everyone has actually come to a pre-agreement on that one, and Villa are happy to cover those wages.
Yeah, and I think on that deal, I think there's two elements to it, right? Like Villa continuing to play in Europe, that is going to play a significant role in their ability to afford Rashford going forward. Yes, they've had the sale of John Duran go through, which gives them, a little bit of buffer there on like a 3 year time horizon. But also, if we think about other potential bidders in the market for Rashford, Barcelona was one of the mooted buyers. I think it sounded like Rashford was also keen on that idea. We've had the news. Yeah, well, we've had the news exactly this week of another one of the infamous levers that Barcelona had to effectively get their revenue higher to be able to afford more wages was to effectively sell early hospitality seats in their new stadium. Now, they went through a number of auditors to kind of ascertain whether the way that they were accounting for all of this made a lot of sense. This week, La Liga have basically said, no, we're not really sure about this. And so I think you mentioned it earlier, it's going to go through another review process. So, Barcelona were already pretty tight in terms of being able to afford Rashford. If you remember back to January, Ansu Fati, they were really trying to get rid of him to create capacity for Rashford. I think they're still trying to move him on. So the fact that they've still got to do that, and now there's this question mark, it kind of does mean that United, from a financial perspective, if they want to get more capacity to spend this season, really need Rashford to continue this vein of form, and for Villa to do pretty well.
That option. Yeah, fully agree, because the market is quite tight for him outside of England. I mean, now he's broken the seal and gone to another English club. I guess there's other options potentially, although you can't really see it being City or Liverpool, Arsenal or Tottenham, maybe. Outside of that, it's really the big clubs in Europe that could afford that wage. Real Madrid, Barcelona, as you say, is going to be really hard for them. Paris Saint-Germain, but they've got Bradley Barcola, who's doing superb this season in that position. Juve could do. Bayern could, but would they? It's super tight just because of the high wages and the fee that United would expect for a player of that quality, at least theoretical quality.
Totally. And I think the starting point for this summer, at least in my head, is Sancho, Rashford,
Anthony didn't get anything.
Malacia and maybe Anthony. I'm still somewhat hesitant about Anthony, although they are going to crowdfund for him, apparently.
Betis, yeah. They can't afford 32 million, which is our baseline, basically. As we've mentioned before, but it's worth saying, if United take a fee that's under the what's left, his book value, what's left on the amortized transfer fee effectively, then there'll be an impairment there. So you may take the cash, but you actually end up in a worse PSR position. It's one of those weird, accounting rules that make no sense to, the eye test, but is the way.
I mean, one thing that they could do look, this may not alleviate things all that much on the fee, but one thing that they did for Donny van der Beek is effectively had a net nil PSR position on him, because they effectively lower the loss that they took on the fee was made up by, or was offset by, the removal of his wages.
Yeah.
So
trouble is, Nancy, he's not on a massive contract, but he's massive fee, reasonable contract. But we'll wait on that one. And then we've got Heaton, Evans, and Lindelof will all come off the wage books as well, because
and Ericsson.
So Heaton and Evans aren't on massive deals, but Lindelof's on a pretty decent deal, and Ericsson's on a big one.
Yeah, I think around about 20 million of capacity that should free up.
It's a good couple of players in the new structure. Yeah,
totally.
All right, and we come on to the last segment, which is a mini interview with Joel Glazer. The Glazers only really seem to talk when they're doorstepped by someone, but this is in relation to the Raymond James Stadium, which is where the Tampa Bay Buccaneers play, which is a bit antiquated. Apparently they haven't been spending capital on keeping this stadium up. Where have we heard this before? But they're looking for a refurb on that one. Will the local council, Tampa Bay, or the Florida government pitch in either taxpayer money or tax breaks to have this done? I should say, the company I used to work for got $900 million from the state of Florida in tax breaks to build their new HQ during COVID. Wonderful building, magnificent facility, absolutely totally empty. There you go. Yeah. Will the people of Florida stump up for a new Tampa Bay stadium?
Well, so historically, that would have been the case, and they would have paid for a significant amount of the new build. I think a lot of the conjecture around that would have been to do with the economic benefits that can come from that. Sounds awfully familiar when you're thinking about the government funding to the area of Old Trafford, to the area around the new Old Trafford in Manchester. But what we have been seeing over the last few years is actually the amount of public funding going towards these new ventures has actually been dramatically decreasing. There are some instances where new builds are actually completely privately funded and no public money is asked for. So like
SoFi Stadium, yeah.
Exactly. That's the one that gets talked about the most. There's about 3 or 4 other stadiums that also have had zero public funding. But I think in more recent times, I think the general range has been somewhere in the region of 25 to 40% public funded. Now, when you bring that into, okay, well, what's the cost of this renovation going to be? Well, if you look at the cost to build and renovate NFL stadiums for the current franchise teams, when you adjust it for inflation, it's about $33 billion, and that's for about 30 stadiums. So on average, just over $1 billion each. Now that is for new builds, but I think the phrase that has been used for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Stadium is like a major renovation. So let's just say for simplicity, baseline, that could cost close to the $1 billion,
mm-hmm.
the $1 billion average. SoFi Stadium, for another point of reference, is about a $5 billion build. As far as I'm aware, I think it's 3 of the family that own the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If you take into account what they got paid by Sir Jim Ratcliffe on the initial investment, that amounts to somewhere in the region of, I think, $450 to $460 million. So a reasonable chunk of what the Glazer family's portion of the new stadium is going to cost. The question is that $1 billion the correct number to be using? Is it lower? Is it higher? If it is higher, where does the rest of that money come from?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing in US sports, but particularly in NFL, is there's basically, because there's a salary cap, there's a baked-in headroom for profitability for owners. I mean, it's why US sports franchises are so massive, like in terms of the valuations. Take football, when the MLS valuations, like a whole bunch of them are worth over $3 billion, apparently, that make them some of the most valuable clubs in the world, and their revenues will be at 30 or 40 million. So like championship level revenues and about that standard. It makes no sense. Same in women's soccer as well, in WSL. The valuations on those franchises really, really high, and the revenues are less than some WSL teams. So it's because it's baked in profitability, closed leagues, no relegation. The risk factor is much, much lower. And so, it's interesting, though, that you say public funding has been coming down, because it's certainly not the impression. The impression we get is it's pure free market economy until it comes to sports. And then the public and the taxpayer funds that, which is amazing. Amazing how sports franchise owners have done that over the years.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's a funny thing. When we were talking about doing this pod over the last few weeks and we were discussing how to do it, we were like, will there be enough news to talk about? It's always going to be news to talk about.
This is Manchester United we're talking about.
All right. Well, Jamie, great to talk to you again.
Thank you very much, Ed. And,
you're off on your holidays to Australia.
Yes, I am. I'm off to Australia tomorrow. So there may be a slight delay on the next episode, unfortunately, but I'll be trying to pay as close attention as I can whilst I'm over down under. The time zones will take a little bit getting used to, but fear not. We'll be back with more as soon as I'm back.
Very good. Well, have a great time down under. Are you going to catch any sports while you're there?
I am actually planning to try and see I think is it the Oceania Champions League? I think the Sydney team has made the semi-finals for the first time, and their second leg is going on whilst I'm there. So I'll try and catch a little bit of that.
Should do. A-League in desperate trouble at the moment financially. They do not have much of a broadcast deal at all, and basically the league overall is going bust. So there you go. Hopefully they'll still be around by the time you get there.
Well, hopefully in 2 weeks it's not all fallen to pieces.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. If you're on the various apps, you can also see our faces on YouTube. And if you're watching here on YouTube, you can catch us in audio wherever you normally get it.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.